Inflammation disconnects the prefrontal cortex from the amygdala and allows the amygdala to make worse decisions. The Western, now global diet, higher in sugar, leading to inflammation through multiple mechanisms, changing our decision-making to being short-sighted and self-centered.
So let's talk a little bit about when we think about holistic care for the brain, and I want to parse this into sort of, if you don't have a concussion and you're thinking about how can I optimize my brain, and then for people who have suffered concussions, whether it is something, and maybe we can even let's actually start with concussions, because I think that people think, oh, well, it's just if I get into a very severe motor vehicle accident, or if, I'm a hockey player or I'm a football player. And of course those things happen, but I think that there's more nuance to, there can be concussions from, falling off a bike, or, just where we see the brain getting jostled just a little bit. And if there's a sensitivity there, then we can start to see some of these concussive type symptoms. So let's maybe start with concussion, because I know that that's your jam, that's your specialty, and maybe define some of the different areas that we might, or different pillars that we might look at when we're trying to evaluate brain health in a concussive patient.
Yeah, so that's a great question and great way to explore that conversation, And the interesting thing is, through this framework that I discovered over 20 years healing my brain and working with patients and teaching other doctors, the 3 pillars of brain health, it's quite amazing because we can take that framework and apply it to concussion, but we could take that same framework and apply it to people struggling with anxiety or brain fog, And what I find so fascinating, because everything's connected, and, the nervous system is one of the master control centers of our bodies. I work with a lot of patients who they had chronic gut issues that were actually as a consequence of the nervous system. It wasn't until they worked on that, and we'll talk about different ways, we can do that, apply these ideas like practically. But that's the beautiful thing is with this framework, it works for so many different types of chronic health issues. But just like you say, my specialty is post-concussion syndrome. Kind of by nature of my own experiences, And so the 3 pillars of brain health, this framework that I discovered, like I said, over the 20 years healing my brain and working with other patients and teaching other doctors, is what I've discovered is you need these 3 pillars to really have optimal brain health. And in this discussion, to be able to fully recover from a concussion. And the first pillar is what we call the physical brain. So I have my little brain model for those of you guys who are just listening right now. I'm holding up this beautiful colored brain model. And what you can see here is all these different, what we call the gyri, the little like squiggles in between all these different regions of the brain. And what that represents is like these different, like deeper built into these like overall structure, our brain cells, right? Our what we call neurons. And the neurons communicate with one another in this fancier term we call neural networks. So you can kind of think about like telephone wires communicating across, distances. And especially now with Wi-Fi, we can communicate across the globe. That's a beautiful example of a neural network. Even though we might be separated, distances across the state or country or world, we can join together with a common purpose, like to share this information, as an example, empower people to, take control of their health. Same thing happens in the brain. You have these neural networks that are devoted and dedicated to specific functions. So we have neural networks that, allow us to experience gratitude and happiness and joy when they're working, right? And so that's the physical brain. It's the actual physical structures, the communication pathways that give us our experience of the world within us and around us. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar of brain health is what I call the chemical brain. And so the chemical brain refers to the neurochemical milieu that our physical brain exists in. So the analogy I like to use is like a tree. So if you have a tree with all the, branches and the leaves, and then you have the roots, like the extra structure, that's the physical brain. But what's it buried in? It's surrounded by and nurtured by the chemistry, the soil, so to speak, right? And so the chemical brain refers to that soil that our physical brains exist in. And so things like blood sugar balance, things such as hormones even, and things such as mitochondria health and nutrients, all those provide sustenance for the physical brain, right? So without the chemical brain, then the physical brain wouldn't thrive. And without the physical brain, then you don't have brain function, right? And you can experience symptoms. And so that's the second pillar of brain health, is the chemistry or the chemical brain. And finally, the third pillar is the emotional brain. And that refers to mindset and our beliefs about ourself, the world around us, the beliefs about our health or lack thereof. All those, it's interesting because in my experience with the emotional brain, there's a lot of physical brain structures that are actually intertwined. So even though I'm talking about the three pillars of brain health, it's all connected, right? But what I found is all three pillars have to be relatively intact for us to really experience great health, and especially when it comes to healing from a concussion, all three pillars need to be in place. And that's what I found. One big mistake I see a lot of patients make, including some practitioners and doctors in concussion care, is just focusing on maybe one of the pillars. So as an example, in a more kind of real world examples, with the physical brain and the structures I described, things such as eye exercises or vestibular rehab or chiropractic, massage therapy, physical therapy, all these different somatic and sensory-based therapies, they work on the physical brain. We can actually trigger what's known as neuroplasticity through that process. The more fancy term is experience-dependent neuroplasticity. So all these different senses and movements we can use intentionally to regrow and heal areas of the physical brain. So that's an example of, different types of therapies that are targeting the physical brain. And like I said, I find a lot of times I work with patients who've had a concussion, they might have gone to a chiropractor or a vestibular therapist or PT or somebody to work on their physical brain. They might have felt better, but then they hit a plateau, and quickly within like 5, 10, 15-minute conversation, I could figure out, oh my goodness, we need to look at your chemical brain.
Right.
And what does that look like? Just like you mentioned before, like looking at stool testing or looking at blood testing and urine testing to explore the actual chemistry, what's going on with the person's mitochondria, their gut-brain axis, what's happening with the hormones,
What are they eating?
Yeah, what are they eating? Exactly. I was about to say that. It's like, do they have food sensitivities triggering inflammation within and impacting the communication, occurring within the physical brain? So it's really important. It's not just a theoretical framework. It's very, important for the recovery of concussion. That's what I see a lot of times. People might just explore one avenue and not look at the bigger picture. And so then a lot of times I see them hitting plateaus.
Yeah. And I also, just to kind of back that up, I see the emotional brain is also often, we don't talk about it because it's very intangible. Like it's really easy to do a stool test and say, look at all the data, or the blood test and say, okay, I have data, right? Or to, maybe we can look at the eyes and we can have some, there's some nuance to understand, like, okay, the frontal lobe is working like this, parietal lobe is working like this, which we'll get into. But I also find the emotional brain is often ignored as well. We don't talk to our patients about how to forgive themselves, about how to have grace and love and compassion for what they're going through. And I don't know if you found that I'm no longer in clinical practice, but it was always lawyers. I had always lawyers who are getting concussed. And I don't know why that is. I think it's because they're head down over paperwork for like 18 hours a day. Yeah. But I would always have lawyers who were type A personalities. And it's like, you have to give yourself the space to heal. And they just would never they would never allow themselves to heal. And then of course they get second impact. Like then something else happens, they re-injure themselves and they're so angry. I don't know if that's that's just a clinical pattern that I would notice. Always lawyers.
Oh yeah.
Always lawyers. Always my lawyers would get concussed. But even if it was someone who wasn't a lawyer, it was always the people with the worst prognosis were the ones who didn't give themselves the runway to actually step into the rehab. Yeah.
Yeah. That's such an important concept you bring up, because that was actually part of my experience, because like I knew all these things in school, and I was just really committed to learning as much as I could to bring it back to my patients and also experimenting on myself. But what I found, and when I talk about the emotional brain with my patients and clients, I talk about how important it is to create that space. And there's actually a neurological basis for that. There's a neural network that's known as the default mode network.
Yes.
And the default mode network, it's tied in. When you look at the brain, when I'm showing you this model here, we have one brain, but we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is very much involved in, what you're describing, kind of like a lawyer, like type A personality. And I actually work with a lot of high achievers, regardless if they're lawyers or they're doctors or they're entrepreneurs. And I find the same thing. But it's funny because that's kind of was my experience in my healing journey. And what I actually not only read about in textbook, it was until I created space in my life, right? But there's specific things, like when we talk about brain training, that's part of the, when we talk about things to strengthen the physical brain, that's part of the conversation. But just like if you're training your body and you're trying to grow muscles, or you're trying to, get bigger or get more tone, as you can't just train all the time. You end up having overtraining syndrome, right?
That's right.
And then you actually lose muscle mass and tone.
Yeah.
The same thing goes for the brain. And so back to what I was saying, it's like the left brain is very much involved with like focused, engaged, concentrated tasks, right? So as a doctor, I do a lot of patient care, and it's like a whole detective process. When I was a student, I was going to school and learning and sitting and absorbing all that, right? But the interesting thing is, and the left hemisphere is involved with this one neural network called the central executive network. And that's a neural network that allows us to have focused, organized thought processes, right? Whereas the right hemisphere, it's more involved with insight and intuition and creativity, and in our context, healing. Yeah. So, and the right hemisphere is very much like tied up with this other neural network I mentioned, the default mode network. So the interesting thing is it's like yin yang though. When you have the left brain activated and the central executive network and you're focused, guess what? The right hemisphere, the default mode network shuts down. So what you're describing, and what I see a lot in my practice and what I experience is totally real. There's a scientific, physical basis for that. Is because when you're so engaged, and I see this a lot with my patients too, when they get so focused on fixing their health, right? They're burning up a lot of mental energy and activating their left hemisphere. Right. So sometimes a big part of when I work with people, a big part of what I do, I'm like, okay, for this phase of care, maybe for the first phase of care, we're going to work on activating your right hemisphere, and we're going to do things to help, engage the healing aspects of your nervous system, right? But the cool thing is it's not just about sitting around doing nothing. There's actual specific ways, just like we can target, different regions of the physical brain, like the left hemisphere to help strengthen. There's also specific activities that you can do intentionally to engage your right hemisphere and allow for healing. There's actually a Chinese term for it. It's called Wu Wei. It's the art of doing nothing. And I talk about that a lot with my patients, because that was my experience. Sometimes you have to slow down to speed up the healing process. So thanks for bringing that up, because it's such an important concept for sure.
I love that. I've never heard that term before, but I always say to people, like, all your gains happen in recovery when you stop. And same like you were saying with muscles, right? Like if you're always training, you don't give your muscles actually a chance to repair and build and grow and get stronger. And the same is true for your brain. I love that. Yeah. When we're thinking about healing from Alzheimer's, in your book, you had a chapter called The Quantified Self, and you identified sort of a hierarchy of priorities to address. And we won't go through all of them, but man, this is such an excellent, I loved this chapter. You started off with energetics, and really when you boil it down, Alzheimer's is, chronic or repeated insults and energetic insufficiency. And in some cases, it's the availability of the substrate to the brain, and the brain, like the cells in the brain, the neurons, their ability to take that substrate and efficiently use it to produce ATP. So walk us through what happens in the Alzheimer's brain, and then how we can begin to bridge that energy gap for better ATP and energy production.
Yeah, it's a great point. And the key here is Alzheimer's at its most fundamental nature is an insufficiency. It's not a simple insufficiency like vitamin C and scurvy. It's an insufficiency of a neuroplasticity network. And you're addressing this by drinking some water. That's fantastic. Great. You're addressing part of the insufficiency here. You're getting better flow, et cetera. So all these things are critical. And I do think wearables are fantastic, because look at this. We're now able to address the energetics. We're able to address the very things, the inflammation. It's so great. We can now measure things like our heart rate variability and see how much stress we have. And I noticed when I started measuring mine, the huge differences when I would do breathing before it versus not doing it. And we're able to measure our ketones, and we're able to measure, continuous glucose monitoring. People find all the time that they plummet when they go to sleep at night. Horrible for your brain. So you're right. We start with the big four. Energetics is number one. And that's four basic things. It's, do you have enough blood flow to your brain to get there? And you can actually look at things like intimal thickness and things like that. So again, you can get good ideas about how you're doing with your vascular tree. You got to get the blood flow. And again, this is why things like exercise so helpful. And this is why I worry about people over controlling their blood pressure. When someone has hypertension, the question should not be, what kind of antihypertensive should I prescribe you? The question is, why did you get hypertension? What's going wrong here? Let's address those things. And we find when people go on this protocol that we developed, usually they are able to come off, or often I should say, they're able to come off their antihypertensives, their statins, and their anti-diabetes drugs because they're doing the right thing, of course. Second thing is you need oxygenation. And so many people have cognitive decline because they have nocturnal hypoxemia. They have it from sleep apnea, which is the common one. They could have it from upper airway resistance syndrome, which, by the way, also increases your adrenaline. So it's a real disaster. They can have it from other things as well. But so you want to know, so it's critical to find out, are people dropping their oxygenation at night? And then, of course, are they dropping their glucose at night? Very common as well. Third thing you have to have is you have to have mitochondrial function. If you don't have the batteries there, then you can deliver anything you want. You got to have the batteries then to make things go. And then lastly, you've got to have the fuel. So the batteries got to have their power, right? And so that really boils down to ketones, which is why ketosis is so helpful in this disease. And in a perfect scenario, you have metabolic flexibility. You burn glucose, you burn ketones. You burn glucose, you burn ketones. People with Alzheimer's have lost both of those. They have the worst situation. They're not adapted to ketones because they haven't been doing appropriate fasting. So they can't make or use ketones. And then secondly, they are not able to use glucose appropriately because they have insulin resistance. So they are literally starving their brains. And you can see it. If you do a PET scan, what do you see? You see reduction of glucose utilization by the temporal and parietal regions. So it's just showing you, and by the way, with people who are ApoE4 positive, you can see those changes late 20s, early 30s, long before you ever have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So you're absolutely right. Energetics huge, so is trophic activity, so is reducing inflammation, so is reducing toxicity. And the great thing, the thing I love about these wearables, you can see this coming. This is another amazing thing about chronic complex illnesses. You can see them coming for years before you get the illness if you just bother to look. One of the guys who's on the protocol wrote me the other day, and he said, well, when I started, he said, you're telling me my HOMA IR is too high? He said, well, I have a glucose that runs around 100. And, my insulin is doing pretty well. It's about, 10. Well, you have insulin resistance. Your body is fighting to try to keep that glucose down where it should be. And in the long run, of course you are putting yourself at greater risk for Alzheimer's. The fact that you don't have it yet is just telling you that you started early enough. Thank you. Let's get you so that you're in an optimal range. So again, CGM, we can now look at our telomerase. We can look at our gut microbiome. We can look at our oral microbiome. Again, heart rate variability, asleep at night, oximeters. I mean, it's fantastic what we have access to so that we can really do much better. And hopefully our physicians will start doing better at working with us on these wearables, and they can now gather data, at distance to help us out. So optimizing our health has not been done nearly enough. And of course, way back when I was in medical school, we were not trained to do any of these things. So I do think that wearables are going to be a major help in reducing the global burden of dementia.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I wear my Oura Ring, and when I look at if I eat too late in the evening, my HRV, it's like it tanks. Same thing with my body temperature. There's cyclical. For a woman, there's like cyclical body temperature fluctuations, but for the most part, I notice that when I eat too close to bedtime, if I don't give myself that 3 to 4 hours before going to sleep, my HRV is awful. And oxygen, I'm so happy that you talked about oxygen saturation. These are, I had when I was in physical practice, I had, I can't remember the name of it now. It was super expensive. It was yellow and black. I forget the name of it, but you can get an oxygen sat, like you can just pick one up on Amazon. They're like $10, they're not that expensive. So these are, in some cases, the Oura Ring is, maybe for some people like cost might be prohibitive, but an oxygen saturation, I think you can buy them for like $10, $15, something like that on Amazon. They're very inexpensive. And, to your point around, your patient with the insulin of 10, gosh, like that's, even though I would not consider 100 for blood glucose normal. That's high by my standards, but it's still considered within the realm of, people will still call that, normal. But a 10 insulin, like your pancreas is working like a mother to keep that insulin in that sort of euglycemic range. So I agree with you. You can see it coming for years. And that's actually, the next point is insulin resistance. And that's, what that sort of increased output of the pancreas, even when you have a euglycemic blood range, is one of the earlier signs of insulin resistance. Yeah. So, and for me, from my understanding, insulin resistance is a very complex topic in and of itself. But often for most patients, it looks like insulin resistance starts in the muscle. So with exercise, weightlifting, even just walking, talking about oxygen saturation, just go for a walk after dinner. You'll, increase your oxygen, like blood flow, and like you get the glucose into the muscles. Really, really profound and relatively cheap way to keep these parameters in range. But as it relates to insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity, why is this? You touched on it a little bit, but why is it important in the context of brain health?
Yeah, great point. There are a number of mechanisms. So first of all, insulin actually is one of the most important trophic factors in your brain. So for example, when we used to grow brain cells in a dish, we always had to include insulin, transferrin, and selenium in the medium to keep them surviving. So it binds to its receptor. And by the way, you can actually see changes in the receptor signaling through a molecule called IRS1 that has a difference in its phosphorylation pattern if you're insulin sensitive versus insulin resistant. And that's been well documented. And actually, Professor Ed Getzel, beautiful work showing that with Alzheimer's, you see this tip toward insulin resistance in these neural so-called exosomes, so that you can really see changes in the brain, really striking, showing that there is insulin resistance in the brain. So the number one, it makes it so that the insulin is no longer functioning as effectively as a trophic support. Number two, you now have hyperglycemia, which has multiple problems where that you now have non-enzymatic glycation. So you have more inflammation. You now have bigger swings. So you now go from hyperglycemia to hypoglycemia. And we hear this all the time, where people will eat late in the day. They'll often have, too many carbs. They go to bed and then they wake up in the middle of the night and they don't know what's waking them up until, once again, a wearable. They do CGM and they find out that their glucose went from 120 down to 45 and they woke up in the middle of the night. So both the hyperglycemia, bad for your brain, and the hypoglycemia are bad for your brain. So by multiple mechanisms, this insulin resistance is actually a critical and incredibly common contributor to, let's call it, suboptimal cognition. Whether you go on to have Alzheimer's or not, you're making your cognition suboptimal.
Maybe you can speak to some of the deleterious effects that prolonged sugar and prolonged insulin have on the brain. So we've been talking a little bit, we started off talking a little bit about brain fog, and we're trying to understand what inflammation is. And, one of the things you've mentioned is that when you have elevated blood glucose or you have elevated insulin, at least, you're going to be activating the microglia. Can we also see changes in the blood-brain barrier? Do we see changes? Are there areas in the brain that are particularly sensitive to excess sugars and potentially accelerating the degeneration there?
So there's lots of different target sites for excess blood sugar and insulin. The first one is, are these, they're called GLUT4 receptors. The GLUT4 receptors are what allow glucose to get into the cell. Mm-hmm. So chronic blood sugar spikes of glucose and insulin make these receptor sites inefficient. So one of the problems with that is the brain has a hard time getting glucose to its tissues and to its neurons to provide fuel for the brain. So that will start to lead to hypoglycemia actually in the brain, where the brain just can't function and can't focus in things that it needs to do, whether it's focus, concentration, or memory recall. So these episodes of poor memory, poor brain function many times, or this chronic or insulin resistance happening at this GLUT4 receptor at the brain. And we also know that insulin itself will trigger what I call tau phosphorylation. This is the mechanism where people build amyloid plaques that associate with Alzheimer's. It just accentuates that response. Mm-hmm. We also know that when you have high degrees of insulin and glucose, you produce what are called glycated end products, meaning your glucose can't get into your tissues because you've had so much carbohydrate your whole life that you lose the efficiency of getting your insulin receptors to work to carry that glucose into your cells. This circulating glucose gets oxidized by free radicals in your bloodstream. Then you create these things called glycated end products. And then in the brain, and below this inflammatory pathway called the RAGE reaction, which stands for receptors for advanced glycated end products, that gets activated in the brain and cause significant brain inflammation, which will then cause injury to surrounding neurons. The blood-brain barrier does become permeable. And the blood-brain barrier is basically blood vessels. So chronic insulin surges turn on several inflammatory mechanisms that start to cause inflammation in blood vessels. So not only is the blood-brain barrier breaking down and the brain's getting inflamed and the brain doesn't have proper efficiency of receptor sites, insulin receptor sites to get fuel to the brain, you start to get risk for vascular disease of the brain. So the second type of dementia, most common dementia, is vascular dementia, and chronic insulin surges promote that. So the two main types of dementia, which for number one is Alzheimer's disease, and the second one being vascular dementia, are all promoted by chronic blood sugar insulin spikes. And even if you don't get to the point where you get such significant decline where you have dementia, where you can't remember friend and family's names and you get lost all the time and you can't find your way home, there's going to be a toll on the brain. Where you just may not perform. Like you may be in your industry and you may be great at what you do, but you can't do that anymore. You may love to read for hours and that's your passion, but now you can't do it anymore. So it doesn't always have to end up being dementia or a disease name. Just the fact that there's chronic insulin and blood sugar spikes is going to have a devastating role in the brain. That's why it's so important to, if you're listening to this, if you eat a meal, you have to see how you feel. The only thing that should happen after you eat a meal is you're no longer hungry. If you eat a meal and you get tired, that's a red flag. You've got some insulin spikes happening. And if you eat a meal and you feel normal again and you're energized, that's a red flag you're hypoglycemic. So the easiest way to determine if this inflammatory mechanism of the brain's happening with you is to just look at how you feel after you eat. And if you have the percentage of carbohydrates and proteins and fats that your body can metabolize and process, you should have no change in energy. After you eat, you should get tired. And if your blood sugar levels are constantly dropping, you have to eat, that's a sign you're going too long without eating, and you need to have some proteins and fats. So that's a really important mechanism. I wrote a book, Why Isn't My Brain Working? I have a whole couple chapters on these mechanisms that really explain these things. After I wrote my brain book, I created an online program called Save Your Brain Program, where we teach people these concepts, and we teach the 6 steps how to really improve your brain function. And one of the most important steps is this blood sugar regulating mechanism. Yeah, and it's essential.
And I'll make sure, by the way, that's in the show notes for people to be able to check out. Because I think it's so important. And we just had Dr. Dale Bredesen on the podcast, and we were talking all about Alzheimer's. So just, reinforcing everything that you just said, we were talking about amyloid precursor protein and the effect that insulin has on that. So if you have high insulin, so like APP is going to, what you want is you want it to be cleaved at the alpha site. If it's cleaved at the alpha site, then we don't have any amyloid plaques being laid down. But if you have a lot of insulin, that's going to be promoting this cleavage. I think it's at the beta and the gamma sites he was talking about. I wanted to just kind of come back to the blood-brain barrier for a moment, because you do talk about this in your book, Why Is My Brain Not Working? Is there, maybe you can explain if there are ways that if we are suspecting, so if someone's listening, they're like, okay, hot damn, yeah, I always have the tea with the honey, I always have the, is there a way that she can, or, anyone who's listening, test or, are there any biomarkers that you would suggest following? Or I know that you talk about there's like a leaky blood-brain barrier test that you talk about in the book. Is that something that you would recommend if someone's sort of looking to see whether or not they're influencing their physiology through excess sugar consumption?
You mean, so the biomarker for blood-brain barrier breakdown?
Not the biomarker for a leaky blood-brain barrier, but generally, if there are pathological features, if we were to do a blood test, would you look at high sensitivity C-reactive protein? Would you look at HbA1c? What would be some of the biomarkers that you like to follow? And I'd like you to talk about the leaky brain test that you talk about.
Okay, sure. So the blood sugar markers that we use are basically the ones that are used in routine healthcare. So the first thing is, are you starting to head into pre-diabetes? So when you get a routine blood test, they usually measure fasting glucose. Yeah. And if your fasting glucose is creeping above 100 in the 115 range, you start to suspect it. If it gets above 115, then the guidelines are you definitely have insulin resistance. That once you see fasting glucose above 115, you definitely know you're going to have these mechanisms take place. And then once you get into the diabetic range, 127 or higher, that's when you have some significant increased elevation of risk with that. And then the classical marker HbA1c or fructosamine are used to look at these glycosylated end products that really promote breakdown of the blood-brain barrier and brain inflammation. If those are elevated, then you're really significant risk for that. Those usually end up happening with uncontrolled blood sugar levels with diabetes. Anything above 7.4 in those, the research shows has dramatic risk. If it's above 9, there's some serious risk factors for that.
Oh man, I can't even, 5.1. Like 5.1 or 5.2 for the HbA1c. I'm like, we have a problem, because that actually tracks out to about 100, a glucose level of about 100 milligrams per deciliter. So, yeah.
Right. Just with this risk studies done, when they find it above 9, it's really scary. What risk you're at for stroke and renal failure and so forth. But, a lot of people do. If you go and test population, a lot of people have those levels. Mm-hmm. And then for the blood-brain barrier, the standard test is what's called S100B. And all the conventional laboratories run the test. And if S100B levels are high, it suggests that the blood-brain barrier may be breaking down. Mm-hmm. There could be other reasons for S100B elevations, but that's one of the key things. Then there's labs that do actually measure things like blood-brain barrier protein antibodies, like Cyrex labs. And those are ways you can determine if that's happening.
In the book, you talk a lot about flavonoids and their role in dampening inflammation. Which ones specifically do you like if you're suspecting someone has, they have chronic glucose and insulin, like they're fasting insulin, their fasting glucose is, something that you determined to be awry, what are some of the flavonoids that you'd like to introduce into someone's protocol?
Well, I think, first you have to get the blood sugar under control. Flavonoids won't be able to compensate for that. You have enough. You're going to have to. So flavonoids, dampen the inflammatory response. They help heal tissues that are injured. And my favorite flavonoids are resveratrol, turmeric, pomegranate extract. I think they have a lot of good research behind them. Green tea extract is also phenomenal when it comes to brain, specifically for research published on brain and anti-inflammatory effects. Mm-hmm. So I'd say the most published ones, and the ones that I like, the ones that are most published, would be green tea, turmeric, resveratrol, and pomegranate extract.
Mm-hmm. So, and maybe I jumped the gun a little bit into supplementation, but what would be some of the strategies that you'd be looking for? Maybe I should have asked you first, how would you like to lower a patient's fasting insulin? So my cutoff is about 85 milligrams per deciliter. I like to see that as my normal, or under 90. What would be some of the interventions that you might look at from either a dietary perspective or lifestyle medicine interventions?
So if you're getting tired after you eat, there's two main things you have to do to change it. You have to increase your physical activity from wherever that is. As you increase physical activity, that makes your GLU-24 transporter mechanisms more efficient. It helps you clear out insulin. So that's one thing. And the second thing is you have to cut down on the degree of carbohydrates, starch, and sugar. That's the basic model. And if you just play with those two, they'll have the biggest effect. If you move more, you will have more tolerance for carbohydrates and sugar and things. If you move less, if you're sedentary, you probably have no tolerance. So, if you maybe gone on vacation and just nothing but laying around, your insulin receptor sites become inefficient. And then if you eat something, you're really, really tired, that's a sign of it happening. And it happens quickly. It also changes quickly. So if you're noticing getting tired after meals and you just start to increase your physical activity, maybe do a 20-30 minute, stationary bike or run or walk or something, you'll notice you won't be as tired after the same meal within a few days. And that's a sign that the insulin receptors are working much more efficiently. And if you do that in combination with cutting down core sources of carbohydrates and starch and sugars, then you will be able to tell. And if you can figure out a balance between that, those two factors, and notice you're not getting tired after you eat meals, that can be beneficial. You can also use supplements to help improve the insulin receptor site while you're doing that. Berberine has a lot of new research now.
Yes, I was going to ask you about berberine.
A lot of comparative, they've actually done so many studies on berberine with clinical trials now. It's gone to the stage where there's several meta-analyses done. Mm-hmm. And all these meta-analyses have shown a very positive effect of berberine and lowering blood sugar. So the evidence is absolutely there, without doubt. So it has the highest level of criteria for evidence. It's grade A level evidence for impacting blood sugar levels. Yep. It's a very cheap and inexpensive ways for a lot of people that can't afford medication to really control their blood sugar. So there's a lot of research being done, because in some developing countries where there's high amounts of diabetes, like India, they're trying to figure out what can we do, because this population can't afford these meds. Right. Finding simple, cheap berberine works effectively, and in some studies even more effectively, in lowering blood sugar levels and improving the insulin receptor sites. So berberine is probably one of the most powerful ones. Things like just inositol, vanadium, B vitamins have also been published. Right. Chromium, they're the typical things you use. A lot of times when you go to a health food store or nutritional manufacturer will put all those things together in one product, just as the general blood sugar stabilizing product. And usually you'll find vanadium, chromium, alpha lipoic acid, B vitamins in there. And then berberine is something you can take on the side. But also be careful with berberine, because it does drop blood sugar levels. So if you're hypoglycemic and you take it, you're going to crash.
Right. So the first thing is nutrition and movement, right? And I find that as humans, we love to complicate things, right? We're like, well, which one? And is it resistance training? And is it hot? Is it HIIT? Is it spin class? Is it CrossFit? Is it, it's like, just go for, if you don't know, just go for a walk. I was going for me and my partner, we walk I do my own workout in the morning, and then we'll, kind of midday toward, after dinner, go for a walk. And it does all the things that you're talking about, right? It's increase it, you're standing up, so you're not seated at your desk. Legs are working, heart is working, you're increasing your capacity for glucose disposal, because the legs are, kind of gobbling up all the glucose that's being out in the bloodstream for that utilization. It's good for the, cardiometabolic, like just go for a 20-minute walk. Right. And then of course you can start to add on from there with all the supplementation. And I apologize for going to the flavonoids first. Like I was so excited because I know you talk about a lot of the botanicals, but we, sometimes we have to get back to the foundational basics of nutrition and movement first, and then supplementing, as the name suggests, to supplement that. Let's talk a little bit about food, because this is one of the areas that I see, giving someone a new diet, as you've already said, is not necessarily the answer, but people really get tripped up because when you talk about having a carbohydrate appropriate diet, whatever that might look like for the patient, I often hear, but I'm not eating sugar. Like I don't have sugar, right? But then you sort of look at maybe a food journal or something and they're having canned tomato sauce and, which is of course filled with sodium and sugar, and, the canned, any canned food really has a lot of, I call them sneaky sugars because it doesn't have sugar on the label. I run a ketogenic program for women, and I have a sort of a cheat sheet for them to take to the store. There's like last time I revised it was like 100 and I think it was 32 different words for sugar, it's like, and they have like really sexy names too. It's like malto, it's like these beautiful, like, oh, that sounds like it's so good for me,
Nectar, agave.
Yeah. Nectar of the
one.
Gods, right?
What could be wrong with that? 70 to 90% fructose.
Right.
Looks good to me.
Yeah. So can you expand a little bit on how sugar, whatever sexy name we want to call it, sugar, processed as glucose or fructose, how that influences our brain in terms of our decision making vis-a-vis inflammation, or however you'd like to expand on it.
Well, there are a couple of dots that need connection here, and it'll take a little time, but that's okay. So everybody has a sweet tooth. That's deeply ingrained as a survival mechanism. Eating sweets in times of food scarcity was important because the sweets that we would find as hunter-gatherers were sweets that contained both glucose and fructose. And the real signal was fructose, not glucose. In the short run, glucose elevates insulin as a response, but it's really the fructose that does the damage. And it used to be a survival advantage in that fructose told the body that we're getting ready for a time of food scarcity. Why? The fruit ripens in the fall to prepare us for the winter, and humans and other great apes, select primates, have a mutation in what is called the uricase genes, the genes that make an enzyme that breaks down uric acid, such that when we consume fructose, ultimately it becomes uric acid, telling our bodies, make fat, store fat, don't use fat, and make glucose for the brain, because we're coming up to a time when there's food scarcity. So in a very real sense, in our ancestral days, it was survival of the fattest. Now, not that being fat was ever an advantage, but the ability to make body fat and to store body fat was an advantage. Not only people who, or even the primate ancestors that survived, were fat, but they were fatter than those who did not survive by virtue of the fact that they could not store fat because of this, their lack of ability to make uric acid from fructose. So that said, we all carry this uricase mutation such that when we consume fructose, fruit sugar, what was a survival mechanism now, coding for making fat, is now killing us. So the consumption of fructose, though it was advocated in recent years because it does not immediately have an effect on insulin levels, that's true, but make no mistake about it, it dramatically affects insulin in terms of leading to insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, increased body weight, increased lipogenesis or creation of fat in the liver, increased inflammation, and even hypertension. Those are the downstream effects of fructose through what is called uric acid. Until recently, and in fact, I would say even now, most healthcare providers think about uric acid only in the context of gout or kidney stones. We now know that uric acid is a danger signal, a stress signal that we're about to have a time when we're not going to have food, so better make body fat. That's all. This is now just becoming unraveled. I'm actually writing a book about this. So when we realize how powerful a signal is to our physiology, fructose is telling us to prepare for food scarcity in the context of the notion that more than 60% of the processed foods available in the 2 million prepared foods or processed foods on the grocery store shelves here in North America have added sweetener, mostly derivatives of high fructose corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup in and of itself. It's a scary notion. Again, it's hacking into our desire for sweet. Nobody can tell you they don't have a sweet tooth. We do have a sweet tooth. A craving sweet or wanting, at least desiring sweet, is like desiring to reproduce. It's built into our system such that it's a primal instinct allowing us to survive. And that's being preyed upon and played upon by industry, by making these foods that contain sugar. And what is table sugar even? 50% fructose. High fructose corn syrup, 50, 60, maybe even higher percentage of fructose. So it's really the fructose that, from an evolutionary perspective, was such a powerful survival tool for us to find fruit. And now the environment has changed. So our genetics loaded the gun, and our environment now is pulling the trigger in terms of all these downstream effects in terms of chronic degenerative conditions like heart disease, like Alzheimer's, like cancer, type 2 diabetes, obesity, that the World Health Organization ranks as the number one cause of death on our planet, not COVID. The number one cause of death right now, when you and I have this conversation, are chronic degenerative conditions, which are by and large related to lifestyle, which are related to inflammation. Now, your question, I think, looked at how does this then play into decision-making? And that was one of the important revelations of our book. In our discovery, in our research, is that inflammation disconnects the prefrontal cortex from the amygdala and allows the amygdala to make worse decisions. Yowzer. I mean, think about this. When the amygdala rules the day, decisions are made based upon what's best for me, not you. Short-term thinking, environment be damned, my future be damned. It's what I want right now. I don't care how it plays out in the future. In the context of the Western diet, which is high in sugar, increasing inflammation. What I'm connecting here is the Western, now global diet, higher in sugar, leading to inflammation through multiple mechanisms, changing our decision-making to being short-sighted and self-centered. And we're seeing that play itself out around the globe. It's a big concept, isn't it? That the change in diet of our planet being perpetrated upon us by the global food purveyors, and there are only a handful of them, is changing how people around the world are behaving, how they see themselves, and how they're seeing others. So it's a sobering realization when we connect those several dots. The good news is there are some clarion calls out there. There's small voices in the distance who are making this information known to others, and hopefully people can realize what's going on and change their destiny.
And what I think is so important is this message of hope, because I think that we have these big food and big ag where you have, potato chips, like Lay's puts their, slogan, like, I bet you can't eat just one, right? It's like,
you can't.
And it's because it's bliss. It's like this bliss point food where our brain just keeps coming back for more. It doesn't quite satisfy us. We need another one and then another one. And then the whole, like, just like the commercial, you see like everyone taking the little chips and then it's all done. And I think that, for the listener, for the reader of this book, it's like, okay, there's not something, I'm not broken. It's not something where I don't have the wherewithal or the power to resist. It's like these things are baked in. They are designed to make you go back for more. They're designed to make you binge. They're designed to, light up it looks like your brain is on crack when you're having, some of these foods. Let's talk about how we can begin with this understanding. So we understand our sleep is being hijacked. The devices, we are seeing the algorithm from the social devices now, coming out in from from URL into IRL into in real life from the algorithms of Instagram and Facebooks and all the other social media channels. We see this division in our society, but how can we begin to pull that back in? How can we begin to tighten the reins?
Well,
on
I
this?
think job one is recognizing that it's happening. Recognizing that these are deep hacks into our primitive brain survival programs. That's the reason for adding salt and sugar and fat to our foods, because we are wired to seek out salt. It maintains our blood pressure. We're wired to seek out fat because it's a very dense source of survival calories. And we're certainly wired to seek out sugar because that signals our body to make and store fat and to make us a little bit insulin resistant. We're also wired to be social beings. We're wired to live in community, right? With division of labor and supporting each other. That was a powerful survival mechanism. And that is being hacked into by this thing called social media, which is anything but. It is not social media because it's leading to further isolation. So how could we call it social? But that's what happens. We are just, desperate for the next post so that we can see how many likes that we get. And the interactions that we get on any number of platforms that are out there, we feel are sustaining, and we feel that we are socially engaged, and we are to some degree, but nowhere near the level of social engagement that is so good for us that we get from being with another person, interacting personally. Even what you and I are doing right now is far more therapeutic for us, if I can use that term, than the mindlessness of hoping we get enough likes and thumbs up or whatever it may be. Those things that we watch, we see functional MRI scans being done on people being shown images with the number of likes displayed. We watch the changes that happen in their brains. And it is just as you mentioned before, it stimulates areas of the brain that deal with, dopamine production and the sense of satisfaction. And really, we crave more. That's what dopamine is all about. It's the craving and its subsequent momentary satisfaction. We're led to believe that we can become satisfied when we buy whatever the next thing is that we think we need to buy because it pops up. And we're never content because we never can buy enough to satisfy ourselves. And that's what being content is all about, is having enough. Our online experience constantly bombards us with the notion that we do not have enough. We need to buy the next hottest color of lipstick. That car is the one that the sexy people are driving. That guy's wearing that really cool wristwatch, and look at the babe on his arm. All the stuff that we think if we do that, then we're going to be satisfied, and we're not. So it's the notion of distancing ourselves from this external sense of satisfaction and finding satisfaction with where we are right now. And it means turning off the computer, the iPhone, your smartphone, your pad, the television, all of these inputs, and trying, at first, it's going to be an effort to become comfortable with not having that input, that powerfully destructive input. Don't get me wrong, there's an upside to our technology. The internet is an incredible democratization of knowledge. I'm all in favor of it. We write books based upon using the internet for research. It's terrific. But we developed, as you mentioned earlier, the acronym of TIME, test of time, TIME, about the internet experience. T, how much time are you going to allocate for what you want to do online, whether it's to connect with friends from high school or research, some biochemical pathway, whatever it is, or buy something that you think you need, whatever it is. Time, is it intentional? What's your goal? What do you plan to do? If this is your goal, great, but don't click the pop-up and go off into who knows where, the rabbit hole where you are lost. M, are you mindful while you're having this experience? Are you keeping in mind what your experience, what your feelings are right now? Are people playing with your emotions? Is this really what I need to be doing during my time online? And finally, E, is it or was it enriching? Now that it's over, am I net positive? Am I feeling like I accomplished something good for me? Or do I feel really crappy now that I just spent that 2.5 hours of my day are gone now because of what I just did online? And what do I have to show for it? It's really important, and we talk about it in the book, that there's a lot you have to accomplish in the day. If you value things like exercise, getting out in nature, preparing your food, meditation, all of the things, so that, when we recognize that 40% of the time, at least in America, that people are awake, they're doing something in front of a screen, 40% of the day. That adds up in a lifetime to 22 years of screen time. Say about that what you will, but I will say one thing, and that is, when you're doing one thing, you're not doing something else. So with 40% of your day already dedicated to being in front of a screen, where is there time for meditation, exercise, preparing your food, interacting socially with other people, being in nature, things that are going to help rewire your brain back to the better decision maker, where you and I started today? And those things are things that people typically say, well, I will find time for exercise tomorrow. And I would say, don't find time for exercise or meditation or other things that are important. Do not find time for it. Make time for it. Find time is, well, if there turns out to be a spare half hour somewhere, I'll jump on the elliptical machine. No, from 2 to 2:30, I'm going to be on the elliptical machine. Or from 11 to 11:45, I'm going to walk outside with my next door neighbor, or whatever it's going to be. From 5:30 till 6:15, I'm going to be working on preparing fresh food for dinner for myself and my significant other, whatever it may be. Not find the time, because if you find the time, then it's fast food. Then it's, I'm still online doing something that really is important. If you apply the test of time, especially the enrichment part, did you really find that you are better off now that you spent that 3 hours down a rabbit hole learning about something or just mindlessly doing something? That's where it really matters. So it's about prioritization.
Right. And I think that that's probably one of the most important pieces of the book is, what is the opportunity cost? Because you said it, if you're doing the social media, if you're mindlessly scrolling or you're using it as a self-soothing mechanism, you're not doing something else, like the meditation, like the exercise or the walk in nature or the getting the sunshine and the listening to the birds chirp. Like, you're not rewiring that prefrontal cortex so that it can inhibit the lower brain centers like the amygdala. So I think that that's something that I don't think enough people will consider, is what is the opportunity cost here? What am I losing by engaging in this activity? And you can kind of take it out to like another 30,000 feet and you can say, okay, at the end of your life, when we think about the top 5 regrets, of people on their deathbed, it's like, I wasn't who I was. I wasn't happy enough. I didn't enjoy the moment. These are principles that you're teaching in the book. And the good news with this book is that as you lay out, you sort of, the whole book is sort of building up to this 10-day plan where you just make these small little changes. Like, it's not like, okay, here's the ketogenic diet, I'll see you in a month, right? It's like, okay, like,
good luck with that.
Good
Test
luck
your
with that.
ketones.
Yeah. See you in a month and we'll see how much, see what your blood glucose looks like. But it's like, okay, today you're just going to limit, you're just going to limit your media today. It's just one day, right? And we can all do something for one day, right?
You can keep a gratitude journal.
Yeah.
You can stop having coffee after 2 p.m. These are little inroads, but they build upon each other. And so that by not having coffee, I don't know, I picked that, but maybe you'll sleep better, or you don't watch TV at night, or you wear amber glasses if you must. And then you sleep better. And then the next day you're going to have a little bit more ability to make a better decision. And that might then open the door to a little bit of exercise. Who knew? And before you know it, life gets better, and it's less involved in people being, of your decision making being sold to the highest bidder, and you finally regaining control. When you said birds chirping, I have to tell you where my mind went, though I'm trying to be as mindful as I can be. We have a mockingbird in a bush in the driveway, and every morning when I go out, I hear this mockingbird. It's just the most wonderful thing, and I've never heard the birds until quite recently. And I know they've always been there.
Yeah.
And to stop and just listen to that, I hate to use the word nectar because we use it kind of in a negative connotation before, but it is. Yes, maybe ambrosia then.
Yeah.
The food of the gods, not the drink of the gods. But there's so much out there to just stop and appreciate. And is it selfish because it's helping me? You bet. Is there anything wrong with that? I don't think so. It ultimately allows me to hopefully be able to practice compassion in my life. And, the Dalai Lama said that if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So, hey, is it self-centered? Yeah, I guess it is, because I want to be happy. And all these things allow you to tap into the gift. And that gift is the prefrontal cortex. Everything in the world is conspiring to keep you out of that area, to keep you out of the gift and lock you into making decisions that aren't necessarily in your interest, but are in the interest of others for whom, who want to manipulate your decision making. And it's a heady concept. I get it. But I would simply ask your viewers to take a moment and ask themselves about their decision making and what is their day like? And are you getting as much out of it as you could? And I would submit that we can all, yours truly very much included, continue to make these changes and to implement these tools to really achieve like the Dalai Lama said, a level of happiness based upon how we're treating other people. And, as getting back to, as you and I started our conversation today, now more than ever.
Let's talk a little bit about the ketogenic diet. And I know that you talked about this in Brain Save, which is your book that we're going to link out to in the show notes. I am a big fan of the ketogenic diet. I've also run a nutrition program for many, many years on, reaping its benefits. So talk to us a little bit about how the ketogenic diet can be a useful medium for helping to heal someone who has had a concussion in terms of, and I'd love for you to touch on like ketone bodies as an energy substrate, and also just for someone who's really like, how can I actually have a lot more natural energy and not have the highs and lows of being glycolytic, as you mentioned, like what their blood sugar picture looks like. So talk a little bit about the ketogenic diet and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, I think the ketogenic diet is a powerful therapeutic tool that can be really helpful for a person, especially after a concussion. One of the reasons for that is, and it goes back to what you're describing, is energy. After a concussion or after trauma, or even after just periods of chronic stress, what ends up happening, right? If you imagine 80% of our energy sources as it relates to the brain is used for our everyday life, right? Our ability to think and focus and move and concentrate and have conversations and emotions and feelings. And then let's say 20% is devoted to like the healing process. Like when we go to bed at night, like energy is being used to recuperate from the day, right? Now, though, after a concussion, what ends up happening, you have this energy crisis where, number one, the brain cells, because they've been injured, they require a lot more energy, right, just to function. But then number two, what ends up happening is that ratio, let's say it was 80-20, gets shifted where a lot of the energy then gets shunted and moved towards the healing process. And so I find a lot of my patients with concussion, they're just like, oh my goodness, like after my concussion, it takes me like 5 times as long to like answer an email, or, 5 times as long or 10 times as long to like remember things or go to the grocery store and get things done, is because they get so fatigued. It's what we call neural fatigue. And one of the reasons for that is this energy crisis. And so that's why the ketogenic diet is phenomenal, because we're pretty much training then our brains to start utilizing fats, or more specifically ketone bodies, for fuel. The majority of us are just, raised to use sugar for fuel, which is a quick energy source and delicious at times, right? But the thing is, it doesn't last. And that's why the example I gave earlier about blood sugar, it's like, if a clue that you have blood sugar imbalance is like you crash around afternoon, or you just you have these ups and downs that you refer to, this roller coaster of energy or your mood, and that's because a lot of our bodies and our brains are relying on sugar. So when we start to increase our levels of healthy fats like coconut oil or olive oil or fish oil or, seaweed, things like that, when we start to shift that to more fat and decrease the amount of carbs, which is pretty much what the ketogenic diet is, and making sure you don't overdo protein, because there's this whole other chemical process that can create glucose. Anyways, like, high amounts of healthy fats, moderate protein, and low sugar, then you start training your body, right, your liver, as well as what we call your astrocytes, which are found in your nervous system, to start utilizing the fats, convert them into ketone bodies as a super fuel. And oh my goodness, like one of the things, I did a lot of things to heal from my concussion. I told you I experimented with a lot of crazy technologies, supplements, labs, whatnot. But one of the things that really made a big difference for me was the ketogenic diet. Like when I did that, like my wife didn't even recognize me, because usually I'd come home from like a long day at the office, just exhausted, like just slumped over the table, eating my food, and then going to bed, or like just vegging out on the couch watching Netflix or something, And when I did that ketogenic diet, and I committed to it, and I was measuring the ketones in my urine and all that, oh my goodness, I'd have a full day, come home, be in this great mood. My in-laws, we'd be at dinner together, like, who is this guy? Like, we like this guy. He's kind of a nice guy, It was a game changer for me. So I find that the ketogenic diet, everyone's different and unique in what they need. And, there's different types of genetic predispositions where maybe having too much even healthy fat might not be a good thing. But I find for about 85-90% of most people, especially with concussion, they do well with that. You just then have to kind of figure out the ratios,
right?
But I find that it's such a powerful therapeutic tool. And now what I do is, like, I did that like hardcore for this set amount of time, like 45 days. And now I know I just kind of cycle in and out of it, right? Where some days, like, I'll fast, I won't eat right away in the morning. And then I'll eat an earlier dinner and then fast, or I'll eat a big breakfast and kind of fast until dinner. So I kind of switch it up and listen more to my intuition now. But I think a great starting point is working with someone, getting like a really solid plan. So then you have a framework, and then you start to tailor it based on what works for you and what doesn't.
And especially when we talk about concussion, it can be a therapeutic intervention. Like, it doesn't have to be, you're never going to have your grandmother's favorite tiramisu again. Like, you will, but maybe for the next call it, 1 to 3 months, right? You
Exactly.
can have this intervention, get your body running on ketone bodies. And to your point, like all the energy, like you sort of, for a lot of people, I noticed that they sort of, as the ketogenic process is starting, where they're making, these de novo ketone bodies, there's this bit of like fluiness, like there's this like, they call it the keto flu, the low carb flu, whatever. And then, but on the other side of that is bliss. It's like, I have unlimited energy. My brain feels great. Yeah. And you can, like you were saying, and that's actually very aligned with my philosophy as well, is there's this therapeutic intervention for a specific goal, in this case, helping the brain heal. And then you can begin to cycle in and out of it as you need it, or, for your, to maintain, like I have a lot of women that come to me for weight loss. So we cycle in and out of it over time so that you can maintain the weight that you've lost. And, we can also work with, protein cycling and all these other fun things that I do with them. But I love what you're saying. That's great.
Yeah, and I think it's all about finding your own set point, right? Your own homeostasis, what works for you. Because it's like with the ketogenic diet, actually with all the dietary changes I made over like the 20 years, right, that I've been experimenting, it's like I found what works for me. And I'm a foodie, right? I grew up eating food's such a big part of my life, and family and friends and connection. It's just like, and
your wife, is she Persian, your wife?
She's Persian.
Oh my God, that food is to die for.
Rice, it glows. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Polyphenols and just one kind of tangent. There's a saying in Farsi, in the Persian language, called ja oftade, meaning falling into place. You know how you've had like Indian food, and then sometimes the next day, like I've made curry, and then the next day I'm like, whoa, it tastes so much better. It's because all the ingredients, but I'm sure there's like both an energetic and scientific alchemy that happens with that. Yeah. But I just love that idea, because a lot of their culture and their food is revolved around this idea. So, but yeah, that's the thing. Through all the dietary changes, it's like I found ways of still eating things that I absolutely love, or at least satisfying a lot of those, cravings, or, whatever the needs underneath the food. Like I don't eat gluten or dairy anymore. I might once in a while, right? But it's like I found other ways and substitutes where I still get that savoriness. I still get that umami kind of hit,
Right.
So there's ways of doing it where you're not like punishing yourself, and you're not like starving yourself. There's ways of doing it in a healthy way. It takes time. That's usually why I recommend people work with someone to kind of find, have a baseline, and then from there, listen to their own intuition.
That's great. So if someone's listening, they're like, I want to know what Dr. Chu did. Like, what are your favorite, maybe walk us through like your daily, like what are your brain habits and rituals? And I'd love for you, the other question that sort of I'm going to tack on to the end of that is supplementation, because I know we can powerfully supplement to help augment brain function as well. So what is like a day in the life in terms of, if you're thinking about how you want to optimize brain function, what are some of the things that you do?
Sure. So I think I like, it's what I call bookending your days. So that's kind of days spelled D-A-Z-E. So this concept of bookending your days, where you create like a sacred space for yourself in the morning, and then a sacred space for yourself in the evening. So what that looks like for me, and it could be different for everyone, is like when I wake up, the first thing I do, as soon as I kind of regain consciousness, so to speak, I think of 3 things I'm grateful for, right? So it's kind of setting the tone for my day, because I found that after I healed my brain and worked on my health, I noticed that whenever I'd wake up, it'd either be from stressful dreams or whatever, I just like worry, or just like think about the day and all the things I have to do, tasks, or either feel stressed or already just going. And it was a terrible way to set the tone for my day, right? So this idea I came up with, bookending your days, right, is in the morning, having some sacred space for yourself, right? Connecting with your higher self. So for me, it's waking, as soon as I wake up, thinking of 3 things I'm grateful for, and I didn't even start there. What I did first was I would have a gratitude journal for the morning. But then after a while, I found I built that into my routine, my neural networks. And so like, I just do that now as soon as I wake up. And then from there, having like kind of easing into the days, sometimes, it might look like meditation. Sometimes it might look like playing some really like flowing, beautiful music, like inspiring music, and doing yoga as an example. And then from there, drinking a bunch of water, taking supplements, eating a hearty breakfast. And then one thing I found too, this goes back to the idea we talked about earlier, the activating the default mode network. One of your access points to that, to this neural network that's related to insight, creativity, and healing, is the vagus nerve. So what I do, especially, I find myself on screens a lot more these days, is the palming technique. It's like this practice developed by ancient Tibetan yogis, where you just take the fleshy part of your palms and just do like a gentle eyeball massage. And that actually activates your vagus nerve. So I'll do that all throughout the day. Like I'll take these mini breaks. I didn't do that one as much when I wasn't on screens as much, but just by the nature of life today, that one I found to be huge. So that's a big part of my routine, is just making sure I take these mini breaks.
And there's a reflex with that too. There's a when you are doing that. Yeah. I remember when I was learning this in class, and we would hook patients up to like a pulse ox, and we would watch their pulse drop and their oxygen, like their oxygen saturation improve as well. So there's like a physiological response to rubbing your eyes. Which is
isn't that cool? I love, that's one of the things I love, is like studying these kind of ancient esoteric practices and then understanding it in the context of neurology. Yeah, it's the oculocardiac reflex. It's between the trigeminal nerve, hits your brainstem, and then activates the vagus nerve. It's like, and it does, it triggers this relaxation response. And again, the vagus nerve is kind of like an access into that default mode network of insight, creativity, and healing. So it's like a 2-for-1, right? Because I'm on the screen and it relieves tension from the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, right, for vision. So it relieves that tension. And at the same time, it gives me this parasympathetic, mini break, so to speak. So that's a big part of my practices, and then, like I said, at night then, like I'll take my supplements, dinner, and then at night I'll have this is like my everyday ritual, then the bookend my days, right? So for my winding down the evening, so it'll be something similar. I might listen to like an audiobook, like some spirituality or spiritual teachings or something, or I might meditate or do yoga or just relax with my wife, just kind of talk about the day and integrate things. So that's what I found to be really effective for me in my life. And there's a bunch of things that I do, like more, maybe weekly or monthly. Like we have all this technology at home, that we use with our patients, like infrared sauna and low level laser and vagal nerve stimulators, all these things that I use with my patients and clients. Like we use a lot of that. And my wife, she's a chiropractor as well. So we'll adjust each other sometimes, or we'll go get adjusted by people. So that's kind of like the big picture. Obviously then, like eating clean, healthy. And we'll do lab testing maybe once or twice a year, just to kind of check in, make sure everything's looking pretty good. So in a nutshell, that's kind of like the routine, both from a daily perspective. Oh yeah, and I forgot journaling too. So I journal a lot, which is really helpful, especially because I'm so busy in my life. I find that when I journal in the morning and, just kind of setting the tone for the day, and then journal in the evening in anticipation for the next day or the week. Oh my goodness. Because before I just kind of like show up in the morning, enter to put out fires at the office or whatever. And I found that just by sitting for a few minutes the night before and planning out the next day even, right? And then I'll do monthly kind of like check-ins for bigger picture stuff. But even just sitting down and being like, okay, what's the most important stuff I have for tomorrow? What are some things that, might trip me up, and how can I show up as my best self? So those are just kind of like questions that I'll ask myself and kind of go through to then prepare me for the next day and kind of let me create that bookend.
So we've talked about short chain fatty acids made by your gut bacteria when you're eating foods high in fiber. We have this postbiotic signaling. We've talked about medium chain triglycerides as a potent, being converted to ketones in the liver, which are direct mitochondrial uncouplers. Could you comment on long chain fatty acids as well? I know that we taught you in the book. You actually go through this in quite a bit of detail, but let's talk a little bit about polyunsaturated fats like ALA, linoleic acid, DHA, EPA, etc.
So one of the things that we have to understand about mitochondria and cellular membranes in general is that these membranes are composed actually mostly of fats and fatty acids. And there are two essential fatty acids that we do not manufacture. Now, the word essential is you got to have them. You have to get them from your diet. And they are linolenic acid and alpha linoleic acid. Now, ALA is a short chain omega-3 fat. LA is a short chain omega-6 fat. Now, recently, a lot of my colleagues are trying to throw short chain omega-3 and short chain omega-6 fats under the bus as the major cause of almost all of our inflammation. And as I show in the book, they are guilty by association. These things are essential. We have to have them in our diet. Now, you don't need too much of them, but we have to have them. And as I point out in the book, there's a very famous study in cardiology called the Lyon Heart Diet Study. And this study was done by researchers in France and Greece. And they took people who had had a heart attack and they were randomized to either a low-fat American Heart Association diet or a Mediterranean diet with added ALA. That was basically a canola oil butter. And it was a 5-year study. It was stopped after 3 years because the results were so dramatically in favor of the ALA diet that it was unethical to continue. And, newsflash. So when researchers, so initially they said, well, yeah, of course, the Mediterranean diet's got all these polyphenols, it's got all this other stuff, it's got olive oil. That was clearly why this diet won. But when these researchers did a analysis of the factors that contributed to the benefit, at the end, the only factor was the blood level of alpha linoleic acid, ALA, a short chain omega-3 fat. The only factor. So why? Because this thing, as it turns out, is a really great mitochondrial uncoupler. And uncoupling mitochondria and blood vessels, as I talk about in the book, is probably how to prevent heart disease in the first place. So we shouldn't throw these guys under the bus. The other thing that's really important is that long chain omega-3 fats like DHA, like EPA, like DPA, DHA is incredibly important for your brain, but it's incredibly important for your brain because it's an amazing neuron mitochondrial uncoupler that I talk about in the book. And it turns out neurons, their mitochondria, if they're uncoupled, you generate local heat. And neurons work best at a very high temperature. And long story short, when we hear about MCT oil improving brain health, ketones improving brain health, it actually isn't feeding neurons. It's actually uncoupling mitochondrial neurons and heating up the neurons. And that actually explains why it works.
So we've been talking about, maybe we'll call them chemical uncouplers, right? We've been talking about taking in polyphenols and taking in dietary fiber. You talk about fermented foods. You talk about polyamines as well in the book. Yeah. Are there environmental, for lack of a better, behaviors that we can be engaging in that will help to augment our capacity to uncouple our mitochondria?
Yeah. And that, again, getting back to my previous book, The Energy Paradox, Dr. Rafael de Cabo at the NIH, who was the researcher who actually kind of uncovered why calorie restriction seemed to be so effective in promoting longevity. And he proposed correctly and proved that it wasn't calorie restriction that was actually the benefit. It turns out when we calorie restrict animals, we tend to give them their portion of food in a single portion, and we put it out. And quite honestly, if you're calorie restricted by 30%, you're going to eat that food very rapidly because that's kind of all there is. And de Cabo, when he looked at the rhesus monkey data that I've talked about a lot, said, I think it has nothing to do with calorie restriction. I think that it has to do with time restriction of how long these guys were actually eating food, and correspondingly, how long they were actually not eating food, how long they were fasting. And he set about proving this in mice. And in fact, he proved that it wasn't the calorie restriction that was the benefit, it was the fact that calorie restricted mice ate their food very quickly and fasted a very long time. And it was the fasting period that was the benefit. Now, why is that? Well, as I go to in the book, normally when we stop eating, about 8 to 12 hours later, we begin generating ketones as we run out of glucose and as we run out of glycogen stores. And so ketones start appearing about 8 to 12 hours after we eat. And they're really revved up about 12 hours. So de Cabo proposed that the benefit of time-restricted eating was that you had a longer window in a 24-hour period of producing ketones, and you would have a longer window for those ketones to uncouple your mitochondria, tell your mitochondria to make more of themselves, and to tell the mitochondria to repair themselves. And when you start looking at it that way, it shows how profoundly powerful time-restricted eating, time-controlled eating, intermittent fasting is when you look at it in the window of the benefit of ketones uncoupling mitochondria. And it's when I kind of looked at his data over and over again, it was just like, holy cow, no, of course this is how it works. Here's the mechanism, and it's uncoupling mitochondria.
So we want to be practicing. Number one, time-restricted eating. And what is your best recommendation around what the ideal what the ideal fasting window, if you will, and eating window should be?
Yeah, Dr. Matheson and his colleagues have made a good argument that probably a 6-hour eating window may be the best. There have been some 4-hour eating windows in humans that have not shown much additional benefit. As many people know, during the winter, I eat all my calories in a 2-hour window for 6 months during the week. And I've done that now for 22 years, entering my 23rd year of doing it. But the point of all that is that continuous ketosis, 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year is really dumb. And it's really dumb because continuous ketosis, ketones cannot produce all the fuel you need. In fact, they're horrible for it. And continuous ketosis tells mitochondria to protect themselves at all costs and to stop making muscle protein. And number two, to actually produce insulin resistance so the muscles don't steal any of the glucose that the brain needs. And that explains why so many, hardcore keto dieters are running high glucose levels. And actually, when we measure them, they have insulin resistance. And they go, that's impossible. I'm perfect. And in fact, you can prove that this is what would happen.
Well, it's use it or lose it, right? If you're not using the insulin because you've been chronically restricting the carbohydrate, that's what the body's going to say, well, we don't need this insulin. We don't need these insulin receptors, or we don't need the sensitization for them to be so great. So I've seen that clinically as well, where long-term keto, we see see a lot that can be overcome with a carbohydrate bolus, but we see very much an insulin resistant state with long-term ketosis.
Yeah, and that's actually why on the weekends I break my 2-hour eating window just to recoup.
Lovely.
So that's one of them. The other thing I talk about. So it turns out cold therapy. Cold is actually an incredibly powerful mitochondrial uncoupler. And cold therapy actually juices your brown fat to uncouple. And the more you uncouple your mitochondria, again, believe it or not, the more short and long-term benefit. Now, similarly, it turns out that Wim Hof and his colleagues who practice breath holding to tolerate cold, the reason breath holding is so effective is that CO2 goes up during breath holding, and CO2 is actually a phenomenal mitochondrial uncoupler. And it actually shows why people who are profoundly good at breath holding, like Buddhist monks, like Wim Hof, can actually melt snow, can actually dry a wet towel on their back, because they can actually uncouple their mitochondria dramatically by increasing their CO2s.
Can you define, because I want to talk about the broken 7 that you talk about in the book, but what is when we talk about dissonance between the brain and the body, you call this the brain-body failure. Can you explain what that is and maybe some clinical pearls or insights? If you had a woman coming into to your office that's maybe in her mid-40s and her mid-50s, and you're suspecting that you're seeing that brain-body failure, what are some cues or some clues that you might be picking up on with her?
There's a lot of them. And, one of the things that I think is an important clue is vasomotor symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, and starting to notice some mood changes, especially in women in their 40s. So I'm a big believer in more information about perimenopause. I think perimenopause is such a pivotal time in a woman's life cycle. And it's a time where, unfortunately, women start to get dismissed more. They go to their primary care doctor and they explain they're having night sweats, or they explain, okay, I don't have major depression, but I've got this moodiness that I never had before. And they often will get, sort of patted on the back and told, well, you're getting older, you're not sleeping as much, you have young kids, that's the reason. And no one bothers to check their blood sugar. No one bothers to check their insulin level. No one bothers to look at, some of these factors that are so important between the body and the brain. So hot flashes, night sweats, I think are really important. I think mood is such an important indicator. It's like a barometer, I think, of the brain-body connection. And it's also, I think hormones drive what you're interested in. And as your hormones start to change, that can be, right after having a baby. Postpartum is a really common time to have this, but also in perimenopause. And the way that I think about the hormonal changes in perimenopause is maybe a little different than some other folks. I don't see it as, kind of this sputtering that happens down to zero. It's more like this initial first phase of perimenopause, which typically is between like 40 and 45, where your estrogen starts to fluctuate wildly and progesterone declines. Mm-hmm. And so it's a period of relative estrogen dominance or dysestrogenism. And then the second half of perimenopause is when estrogen starts to decline. It's not fluctuating wildly quite as much. And overall, it's less than what you had. And we know that for women who are really sensitive to their estrogen levels and to their testosterone levels, it can lead to mood changes. And what I always ask my patients is, tell me about your pregnancy. What was your mood like? What was your mood like after you gave birth, if they've had children? Because that postpartum period is often a preview of coming attractions in terms of the brain-body connection. So I mentioned estradiol and progesterone, but there's also thyroid, there's testosterone, of course, there's cortisol. So I think cortisol is in many ways the elephant in the room in terms of brain-body connection in both directions, because we know the gut-brain axis is bidirectional.
Yes.
So I think those are some key issues. Another one is the mitochondria. I have so many patients who give me this clue. They say, I love to exercise. I've exercised regularly, but I just don't recover the way that I used to. Or I'm so tired. I can't do burst training. I know you told me I should do some HIIT training. I just can't do it. I'm too exhausted. So that level of kind of exercise fatigue is another clue of what could be going on. Now, there's also the work, if we could get geeky for just a moment here.
Oh, please.
There's the work of Lisa Mosconi, who I think is super interesting. She just published XX Brain. And what she's shown is that 80% of women over the age of 40 start to have this slowdown of their brain energy. 80% of women. So that always makes me curious about, okay, what's going on in that other 20%? I want to study them and see what's different.
What the outliers look like. Yeah.
What do the outliers look like? And then for these women, the 80% who have this slowdown, the technical term for it is cerebral hypometabolism. What we know from PET scans that Lisa has done is that the way that glucose moves around in the brain starts to change. It declines. And it's substantial. It's like a 15% decrement in perimenopause and like a 20+% decrement in menopause. And when I explain this to my patients, when I say to them, listen, do you find that your brain is slower than it was before? Are you having more difficulty multitasking? Are you walking into a room and you can't remember why? Like those are some of the clues that tell you that this brain-body connection could be disrupted.
And is it because the glucose, do we know that, the way that the glucose is transporting, is it that it's not being taken up by the cells as efficiently anymore? So you're having more glucose that is not being used to make ATP? Is that what that is?
I would say the mechanism isn't totally clear yet. What I understand from Lisa's research, and this was just discovered in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
What I understand from her research is that it seems to be the decline in estrogen in the brain that kicks off this process.
Right.
But the point you're making, I think, is important too. Is this related to what I think of as insulin block or insulin resistance, where your cells become numb to insulin in the rest of the body? Like, is it also happening in the brain?
Yeah.
And so there seems to be a correlation between the two. And we know that, these could be some of the very early steps that lead over a few decades to Alzheimer's disease. And as someone who has Alzheimer's in my family, I'm super interested in that particular area. And so we know that the same enzyme, insulin degrading enzyme that deals with your blood sugar and trying to stabilize your blood sugar, is also the enzyme that helps to break down beta amyloid.
Right.
So controlling your blood sugar, I sometimes joke that I want people to care about their blood sugar the way that they care about their retirement accounts, because it is your retirement account. Like it is the most important lever when it comes to brain health, and such an important lever when it comes to the brain-body connection.
I just, earlier this week was just, you and I were chatting about this. I just interviewed Dr. Dale Bredesen. So we were talking exactly about what you're talking about, this insulin degrading enzyme, how it is one of the factors that degrades and eats up some of those beta amyloid plaques. I think we were also, I can't remember if we touched on this or we were talking about this in the pre-chat, and we'll get to this. I want to get to this with my conversation with you as well, but zinc supplementation can also upregulate neprilysin, which is another compound that will also degrade those beta amyloid plaques and those tau tangles. So I am in 100% agreement with you. I think that understanding the glucose insulin dance that you have, not only, we can talk about weight. I mean, I have always women coming to me first for weight, but then once we get past the more superfluous reason, we talk about healthy brain aging and promoting healthy brain aging and function and brain fog. Like that is probably the number one thing that I have women complaining about is this constant foggy thinking. So I wanted to maybe talk about that, and we can parse that with a conversation around set point, because in your book you talk about this idea that 80% of women are I mean, it's such a disheartening stat that 80% of women are dissatisfied with their bodies in some way. And part of that is because there's this continuous creep, if you will, of an increasing weight. And the other flip side to that, which I think is actually two sides of the same coin, is this idea of brain fog, where this woman there's some chronic low-grade stress, chronic low-grade inflammation, and she has this foggy thinking, and she's not able to focus, she's not productive, she's not able to concentrate. So can you maybe talk about what are some of the contributing factors to, and we can do this one at a time, we can talk about set point first, like what are some of the reasons why a woman's weight would continue to increase over time? And then I'd like to kind of flip that around and talk about brain fog.
Absolutely. Well, so your previous question was about, what are the symptoms? What are the clues of a disrupted brain-body connection? And I think brain fog is one of the most important ones. I agree with you that weight is also important, because I think this rising set point, as it is with you, it's the thing that gets a lot of women into the door of my medical practice. And then once we start to look under the hood, we see all these other issues that need to be addressed. So I think that's really key. Anxiety, depression, those are other clues. Addiction. I think our understanding of addiction in this context is really poor, but we're making some progress. And then early memory loss. Since you mentioned Dale, I feel like I have to tip my hat to him. So with brain fog, I think that's another important clue of cerebral hypometabolism, of this slowdown that happens in the brain that Lisa Mosconi has researched so well. And what was interesting to me, Stephanie, is that I have a lot of patients who complain to me of brain fog. And when I went to the medical literature to start to look at this, I realized that it's not considered a real entity by conventional medicine. Now, this isn't the first time I've been disappointed by mainstream medicine, but it makes it much harder to research and to understand the underlying mechanisms, and then to come up with the proven solutions when you don't even consider it a problem to start with.
Right.
From more of a precision medicine, personalized medicine, functional medicine perspective, I think of brain fog as the clue, a more specific clue than brain-body disconnection. It's about membrane permeability. So it makes me think of loss of integrity of the intestinal lining, and also loss of integrity of the blood-brain barrier. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the way I think about brain fog. I especially see it, I certainly see it in my patients who are in perimenopause and menopause. I certainly see it in my patients who have blood sugar issues, which, if you look carefully enough for it, as I'm sure you do, it's, 50 to 70% of my patients.
Always. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the other population that I see it in a lot is my patients who come to me who are breast cancer survivors. And they've had chemotherapy, they have chemo brain. I think that's another really important population. But you raised this point about the adipostat, the set point, and I think this is a really important topic because, what I found as I tried to navigate my 30s, and I imagine this is true for a lot of our listeners and viewers, is that I had my first baby at 32, and I had my second baby at 38, and it was so hard to lose the baby weight. I mean, first of all, I gained too much because I have a food addiction tendency, and when you're pregnant, that's when, you just
I'm eating for two.
Yeah, you think you're eating for two. It's like, no, you're eating for 1.05.
I know, it's so true.
Yeah, so I gained all this weight, and then I, all the usual tricks that I had in terms of exercise and cutting calories and even cutting carbohydrates just didn't do the trick when I was trying to lose the weight postpartum. And so we know that that's a really vulnerable time. But even for women who haven't had children, what we know is that there tends to be this kind of steady increase of gaining weight. And unfortunately, especially over the age of 40, it tends to be more fat mass and less muscle mass, which also, disrupts that body-brain connection. So the adipostat starts to change, and the way that the adipostat, or the set point in the brain, works is that it closely monitors your calories, probably your macronutrients, and makes adjustments in hormones, downstream hormones, such as ghrelin, the hormone that tells you to pick up the fork, and leptin, so that your appetite is supposed to be closely regulated. But what I find in a lot of my patients is that the adipostat gets jammed. And I certainly experienced this in my late 30s, where I just was hungry all the time. And it was very hard to manage until I started to address the hormonal root cause, which in my case was related to leptin and insulin and ghrelin.
It's interesting. I find most of the women, just as an aside, sort of a clinical pearl, I find that most of the women that I work with, they have some degree of leptin insensitivity, meaning that when they should be putting the fork down, as you said, so ghrelin is the thing that makes you, pick the fork up. Leptin is the one that makes you put the fork down. Like, okay, I've had enough. There's one, they will overconsume calories to the point where the leptin action on the hypothalamus in the brain is just not there. And there's been quite a few studies that are actually quite old. And when I first found these, I couldn't believe that I hadn't heard of them earlier, but literally for every measure of BMI, every measure of body weight, women compared to men, women have more leptin insensitivity. So they will consume more calories at any given level of obesity. So we are just exquisitely sensitive, I think, to becoming more leptin insensitive just by proxy of being a woman. I was speaking recently to Dominic D'Agostino. We were talking about exogenous ketone supplementation, and he mentioned that you have really been instrumental in his thinking around exogenous ketone supplementation, and wanted your thoughts on their role as we're talking about insulin sensitivity and the inability now for our neuronal cells to uptake this glucose potentially. And how do exogenous ketones play into that? When you mentioned before that Alzheimer's patients have lost both the ability to take glucose and potentially also ketone bodies up. Does that play a role in terms of therapeutics?
Great point. And this also came from Stephen Kinane, who did beautiful work showing that you can bridge that gap. So again, you see someone who's already having some cognitive issues wherever they sit. Their PET scans are showing you they're not utilizing glucose well, and usually they're not very good at utilizing ketones either. So again, it's the worst of both worlds. So I consider this a metabolic emergency. They are not giving their brain the amount of energy support that it needs. So we got to fix both things. We want to return them to insulin sensitivity, and we want to return them to metabolic flexibility so that they can also use ketones. Now, the problem is on day one, it's going to take a few weeks to make them insulin sensitive. And as you know, exercise is a critical piece of getting people insulin sensitive. Of course, diet, huge piece. And of course, sleep and stress. These are all critical pieces of making them insulin sensitive again. You got to ease them into it. During that time, their brain is dying. So what we do then is you bridge the gap on day one by using exogenous ketones. You can use NCT oil, you can use ketone salts, ketone esters, you can use coconut oil. You have to recognize, yes, in the long run, you're going to want to use endogenous ketosis, but you don't want to wait that long. So just help at the beginning. And as Dr. Kinane has shown over the years, you can bridge that gap by getting yourself into ketosis or even by taking exogenous ketones. So what we say is essentially it's a 3-step process. Step 1, bridge the gap with some ketones. Just get it there. make your brain say, that feels much better. I was dying here, not getting enough support. Step 2 is let's get some insulin sensitivity so it can now also begin to use glucose better. And then step 3, over months, you can now drive yourself into endogenous ketosis and metabolic flexibility. Now you've got the best of both worlds. You can use the glucose. And I know that, the Scherzais, if Dean Scherzai and Aisha Scherzai have pointed out appropriately, the brain likes glucose. Fair enough. The problem is you've got a state now where you've driven your brain into an insufficiency through overfeeding. That's the paradox. It's excess led to insufficiency because now you can't use the glucose and you're not producing the ketones. So we want to restore that. So this is why I worry about people who, when they have very low BMIs and they say, okay, I'm just going to start to do big fasts. No, they often go backwards when they do that. You really want to add, but these people often, many people will already have some degree of excess fat. So for those people, they actually are often easier to help because they can generate the ketones more easily. So, but the bottom line here is you're in an energetic emergency. It's insufficient and you need to get that. Now, if you also have mold and other things, you got to deal with that ultimately as well. But step 1 is make sure that you're able to get enough energetic support for your synapses and neurons.
Well said. I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories. I was telling you in the pre-chat, I just was so, I fell in love with Kristen, with patient 0, her story. My heart was breaking in the beginning, and then her whole story was so hopeful. And part of the reason why I think this book is so important is, you talk about a lot, you talk about all of these different remedies and, this panacea of, nootropics and stacks, and here's how you detox, and here's the inflammation, and here's the labs you should get. But then there's also this through line of hope, which, we started off talking at the top of this conversation that, there's never really been, we all know cancer survivors. We've never really known Alzheimer's survivors. And, the title of your book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's, I think is so powerful. And these stories are so hopeful. So I thought if we could talk about Kristen, who I know that was a pseudonym. So her real name is Judy, but let's talk a little bit about her story and, your interaction with her, because she was your first patient, was she not, back in 2011?
Yeah. So in 2011 was when we proposed a trial and we got turned down. We couldn't do a trial. And I actually got a very nasty call from a guy who had supported our development to get to this trial. And he said, if you were working for me, I would fire you because, you should have gotten this trial approved. Instead of like, okay, I'm sorry, this is the way IRBs work. And I was very depressed about this. And shortly thereafter, April of 2012, I got a call from a woman who lived in San Francisco who said, my friend who's back on the East Coast has just been told she has Alzheimer's disease. I know you guys are doing some research with mice and things like that. And I know you tried to do a trial, but you got turned down for your trial. Would you at least talk to her? And I said, well, look, we got turned down for the trial, so I can't get her into the trial. There is no trial. But I'm happy to talk to her if you want to have her come out from the East Coast. And so sure enough, she ended up coming out. I hadn't seen a patient in 20 years. I've been working with mice and fruit flies and cells and things like that. So she came to my office at the Buck Institute, as she describes, and we went 2.5 hours going over all the stuff. And she was writing things down because she couldn't remember much. She had been told she'd watched her mother die of Alzheimer's. And she'd been told she had the same thing. It was still relatively early on. She was having trouble, all sorts of trouble. She would get lost. She couldn't do her job anymore. She couldn't remember things. She would call her pets by the wrong names, all these sorts of things.
She said in the book that she took a nap. I couldn't believe, she was flying somewhere, took a nap on the plane. Yeah. She woke up from the nap. She had no idea where she was going, where she was flying, who she was meeting. So I think it was Dallas. She might've been flying to Dallas. And then she lands in Dallas and is like, well, I don't know why I'm here. And then literally just takes the next flight back home.
Yeah. That's how bad things had gotten. And she had already decided that she was not going to allow herself to go through what she watched her mother go through. And so she had decided she was going to commit suicide. And she talks a little bit about that in her chapter. She was saving up pills for the day when things weren't so good. So we went over this and we talked about the different pieces, just as you and I have talked about here. And I said, look, we haven't done this. This has been in mice. We were going to do a trial. It hasn't happened. Take this back to your doctor. I frankly never thought I would hear from her again. Take this back to your doctor, give it a try. And, if it helps, great. But luckily for all of us, she was very determined. She said, I'm doing this. And the people who do the best are often diligent and detail oriented. They often will work with a spouse or a health coach and that sort of thing. And they often okay, I'm going to get myself into ketosis. I'm going to do these things. So she went back and I didn't hear from her for 3 months. And on a Saturday at my home, I got a phone call from her and she said, I can't believe it. My memory's better than it's been in 20 years. I'm doing great at work. I'm so much better. And she remains better. Now, it's interesting. 4 times, as I mentioned in the book, she's gone off the protocol. And each time it takes about 7 to 10 days for her to start to slip again. So you really can see this is a dynamic process. But as long as she's stayed on this, she's done very, very well. She's actually become a yoga instructor. She's become a brain health coach. And she's done very, very well. And she was on a recent Facebook Live with a few of the other survivors talking about what it felt like to get better. Hats off for all of us to Judy for the great work she did, because it really kind of put us on the right track. When I got that call, I hung up the phone and I looked at my wife, who's a functional medicine physician, and I said, it worked. All the lab work we'd done all the years, it actually was pointing us in the right direction. I was very excited about it.
And one of the things that I felt so drawn to her story because I felt connected to her in that she was very driven in her career, was traveling and she started noticing these changes in her 40s. And she talks about this idea of brain fog. I started, and it wasn't all the time. It was sometimes I would get this brain fog and I would feel, foggy and, lack of clarity. And one of the most common things that I hear in my women in perimenopause, in their 40s and late 40s into their 50s, is this idea of brain fog. And that's not to say that all brain fog is Alzheimer's. I'm not trying to, ring the bell there, but I think that it's important to notice that these subtle changes, these changes slowly happen over time. So wanted to point that out. And I know there's 7 stories and we won't get to all of them, but the other person I wanted to talk about was Deborah, who her father was a neurologist. Her mother, I think also, was it her mother, her grandmother?
Her father's mother, her grandmother.
So grandmother died from Alzheimer's, and her father was a very prominent neurologist. Yes. And she describes this time where her father goes shopping, goes out for groceries, and then doesn't come back, for hours later. So she's frantically driving around town trying to find him. Yeah. And then she sees him, they make their way back home, and then they're sitting at the table, and her father, who is a neurologist says, she's like, we got to get you help or something. And he says, there's no help for what I got.
Yeah. She said, we got to get some, let's take you in and get some pictures of your brain. Yeah. And he said, what I have, no one can help. And it's sad because he passed away right around the time that she wrote this. And so it was really, really tough. At the same time, watching her grandmother and watching her father both pass away, and then realizing she herself had the gene and she herself had the early symptoms. And then she actually went in and got tested, and they showed that she wasn't doing that well on her cognitive tests. She looked at her children and thought, oh my gosh, what's in the future here? And so the whole idea here is, let's break this cycle. Let's end it with the current generation. And she has done very well. And now, the reality is this is an option. Her children don't have to get this. She found out that she has the ApoE4 gene, which about 75 million Americans have. And so let's make sure that none of them ever gets this in the future.
And what are some of are there, with the pushbacks that you've received as a clinician, as a researcher, I would also imagine that these patients, when they start to say, hey, I'm like, maybe something's wrong here. Like, and people might just chuff it up to, oh, this is just probably normal aging. And then if they get on your protocol and start feeling better, I think it would almost be very easy again for, whether it's their peer group or their friends to say, how do you know you're really doing better? Isn't it just like placebo? Was there pushback or skepticism that some of these patients endured in going through your protocol as well?
Absolutely. And the doctors will often tell them that, this is silly. This is not what's going on. Everybody, one of the things they say is everybody knows there's nothing that can be done for Alzheimer's. If there were something that could be done, it would be on the front page of every newspaper. Well, yeah, because of the experts claiming this, it's not going to get on the front page. And so, as an example, I wrote to a major medical journal that had published a pushback, a negative comment on our studies. And I said, fine, I'd like to rebut this if it's okay. And the editor said, no, there's no interest in having you rebut what was published. So these are very, anti-academic, anti-intellectual responses. And they, again, just further show that we're in the midst of this revolution. But, I get it. If you want to continue with fundraising and you want to continue with your reputation, you don't want to be saying, yeah, we were on the wrong track and here's something that's better. In the long run, I think, people will continue. The data will accumulate and we'll get to the point now that we've finished the proof of concept trial. We're now in the midst of planning the RCT. The randomized controlled trial. So, step by step. But, you look at the history of something as simple as scurvy. Every century, people would find a treatment for scurvy, and then the doctors would say, no, that's not really helpful. And they would find it again, and they would say, no, it's not helpful. And it took hundreds of years and lots of people dying before it was accepted that we understand what's going on with scurvy and we can actually do something about it. Look what happened with Semmelweis, who wanted people to prevent infection by washing their hands and was thrown into an insane asylum where he died.
Those little germs that are on our hands and no one can see. You're crazy. Yeah.
How can they be there? It's crazy. Yeah. So this is the history. Unfortunately, we don't have, Silicon Valley is all about disruption and rapid change. Medicine is about tradition and permission, understandably, because we don't want to hurt people. It's primum non nocere. But when you've got something, you've got nothing that helps these various diseases, ALS and Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body and all these things, you do have to start looking to see, what can we do that's beyond? I had something I actually put in Judy's chapter that, that you have to look at changing things. You have to look outside the box, basically. And so, this is what's going to happen with all of these things. And we need to be a little more open-minded.
As a clinician, and there are many clinicians who listen to this podcast, one of the frustrations, I will just, in the spirit of being open and honest and transparent, in my earlier days as a newer doctor, I had that same hubris. Like, what is wrong with this patient? Like, they came seeking my care. I spent an hour doing these clinical tests and telling them their report of findings, and I'm giving them the information that they need. And I think that there was, you can very easily fall into that trap thinking, well, there's malintent here. Like, this patient just doesn't want to get better. And one of the things that I love about really the thematic of your book is that we shouldn't be judging the behavior of the patient or the person, that there's an upstream issue. Like, it's not the behavior. The behavior is a result.
Behavior is the manifestation.
It's the exactly.
Who knew?
Yes. Who knew? Right. Exactly. So all of these behavioral mod interventions are not actually getting at the root cause of the problem. And, I think that you so eloquently just described, the amygdala and the midbrain versus the, newer area of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. And in my training, it's our humanity. Like, that's what makes us human. And one of the big, some of my mentors in the functional neurology world will talk about this idea that one of the main roles of the prefrontal cortex is this idea of inhibition. So you have the amygdala, the child, right? Like you were talking about, like, I want the donut. I want the donut. I don't care what I got to do to get the donut. And then you have the adult that's like, okay, honey, like, I know you want the donut, but why don't we do some, squats or something? Like, why don't we do something to earn the donut, or whatever it is. So you have this adult that's inhibiting these lower brain centers that is going to allow for these better decisions.
Yeah. We tend to, let me use a metaphor here that I think will make it very clear. And that is in the doctor patient or healthcare provider client interaction, we tend to think that we're going to hit the ball over the net. And then it's up to that other individual to then it's their turn. I think that we should both be on the same side of the court and working together, as opposed to it being one way and then waiting for that response. And again, recognizing what you just said, I think is really very important, that there are so many things that are keeping that individual away from the ability to make those decisions. And here's a real world example then. Patient is coming to see you with type 2 diabetes, and what they would typically get, here it's a new doctor, what am I going to get? They're going to walk out of the office with a good diet, whether it's ketogenic or at least it's low carb, whatever that doctor thinks is going to be helpful for that diabetic. But darn well that that patient has gotten that diet or other diets countless times with other healthcare providers, and they don't work. Why don't they work? Because that individual doesn't have the decision-making tools to implement that or any other good information. We have to come upstream and work first on the decision-making process, then we can layer on all the great stuff. But until we work on their decision-making process, we're not going to make progress. So it might be that you say to this individual that, you're probably expecting a diet, but we'll get to that. What we need to work on is getting you in a better frame of mind such that the information I give you will be better you'll be able to implement more readily. And it might be that this week, until I see you again, or 2 weeks, we're going to work on your sleep, for example. Now that's going to raise eyebrows. Well, I'm diabetic. Why are you concerned with my sleep? Well, we could talk about the relationship of lack of sleep to insulin resistance, but more importantly, we could talk about the relationship of poor sleep in terms of its length and its quality and how that relates to decision making. How even one night of non-restorative sleep activates the amygdala by as much as 60% increase in terms of its impulsivity activity, in terms of decision making, just one night. We all know that when we stay up late and don't get enough sleep, our food choices the next day are crappy. We eat junk food because we just can't get our arms around bringing online that prefrontal cortex of the adult and then making better decisions. We know that people who chronically don't get enough good or restorative sleep will consume as much as 300 extra calories per day, which adds up to about a pound of body fat in about 10 days. So this isn't, and what does that do? You gain weight, then you develop sleep apnea, you sleep more poorly, you make even worse decisions. It's a feed forward, terrible pun, cycle. But that said, let's find an on-ramp for better decision-making for each individual. And in a person whose primary problem may well be diet-related, the on-ramp is not going to be to give them a better diet. It will be as useless as it's been in the past. Let's talk about getting out into nature. Maybe we'll try 20 minutes of meditation each day. One of the biggest traction points that we have leveraged is sleep. So incredibly important for reducing inflammation, reducing cortisol, both of which have a huge effect directly on disconnecting the prefrontal cortex from its ability to exercise this top-down control and reining in the amygdala, this parent in the room, if you will.
Yeah. And it's sort of like you always hear like neurons that wire together, fire together, but the opposite is also true, right? Neurons that fire apart will begin to wire apart. So the longer that you have this, and we're going to talk about this disconnection syndrome, which is a syndrome that you present in the book with all of the different tentacles, if you will, or, tributaries, if you will, of a river leading into this big.
Right now I have an octopus in mind. I got the tentacles and the suckers. Man, it's great. It's a great metaphor.
So we have this disconnection syndrome, but there are low level ways, like there's the low hanging fruit, if you will, that we can begin to hack into this. And if I extrapolate a little bit, and you can tell me here if I've gone too far, but what I think you're trying to do here is you're trying to hack the parasympathetic nervous system, because what happens in modern day, and we can begin to sort of wade into the waters of what are some of the modern, corrosive, behaviors and activities that are killing our ability to make better decisions. But what I observe is that people are always in this state of threat and this sympathetic tone, like this sympathetic dominance. And there's not and while I believe that the sympathetic nervous system is brilliant, it is essential, it's also just supposed to be there for a short delta T. Like it's supposed to be in and out, right? But you're driving all the time. You're going to a job that you hate. You have a toxic family relationship. You're eating the sugary, jelly donut, or you're not getting enough just generalized low movement. And you're in this kind of stress response, this chronic low grade inflammation that you talk about in the book. So let's, first let me ask you, is that a,
workable model?
Yeah. Is that a workable? Are we trying to move? Is it that you're trying to sort of hack into the parasympathetics here by getting out in nature and having more movement? Is that a reasonable assumption?
It's right on target. And when you think about what you just described in the context of our last year, the world conspired to make us be really locked into a sympathetic existence, where day in and day out we've been threatened. The next shoe is going to drop, and there'll be a variant that the immunizations are not going to work again. Whatever it may be, every day it's something new to add on that really ends up amping up our fight and flight activity, our fear of what's going to happen next. And what does that do? Well, it acts to destabilize us through multiple mechanisms. Yes, it activates the creation of this chemical called cortisol, which changes the array of bacteria that live in the gut. It destabilizes the gut lining, making it more permeable, and that then amplifies inflammation. In addition, it plays a significant role in dysregulating our metabolism such that we are much more predisposed to insulin resistance and elevated blood sugar, paving the way for us to become type 2 diabetic. It also leads to the increased production of body fat, and certainly the lifestyle choices that we make are in a stress condition are not as salubrious as they could be if we were in a different state of mind, if you will. So step one is to recognize that the world is fanning the flames of our stress. And we are being taken advantage of by news media, by social media, by really so much of our day-to-day experience that we can regulate, that we can put into appropriate context and deal with. The important step one, though, is to realize that it's happening. Step two, realize how threatening it is for us. And then step three is to deal with it and make the changes that we talk about in the book. But, make no mistake about it. Whatever affiliation a person might have in terms of what news feed is directly going into their brains, whatever right versus left, it still captivates us by amplifying the sense of doom and gloom. And that's what sells. That's what keeps us coming back for more. It is, in every sense of the word, addictive. The problem is that the more we experience that, the more we feel that we're going to miss something if we don't stay tuned in. And we seek out then ways of quickly satisfying ourselves for the next issue that's going to come along. Hence the incredible number of pop-up ads that appear magically in our feeds, magically in an area that we were thinking about or may have been speaking about just yesterday. How does that happen? I'll leave that for others to describe to you. But the point is, it immediately takes us away from anything that we may have been doing that was good for us or constructive. And it really gets us to, I think, our discussion of social media and what is our online experience like, and how destructive that is in terms of actually, as you mentioned, rewiring our brains. You quoted the work of Dr. Donald Hebbian theory, who stated that neurons that fire together will ultimately wire together. It means the more you do something, the more indelible that connection becomes. It's how you learn how to swing a golf club or play a tune. And if your mind is constantly engaged in the sense that the next threat is going to come right around the corner, your body and mind are going to be set up for that. And it's going to be very difficult then for you to appreciate that the world is in a different way, that the world is actually, a loving environment for us today for the time that we have left. And, that's for many people, the notion that the world is flat, not round. They just cannot get there. And we talk about that in the book because the more we lock into, as we talked about earlier, the amygdala, the less we are able to engage something called cognitive empathy, which is basically the ability of a person to experience another person's perspective. For example, you may feel a certain way about something. Cognitive empathy on my part would be for me to try it on. What is it that you're telling me? That, I don't know, pick something outlandish. The world is flat. And I don't necessarily believe that, but you may believe it. And I think that the agora, the marketplace, is where we used to freely exchange ideas and come up with new ideas. These days, it's one way or the other. It's either black or white. There's no gray. There's no common ground. And, that is to our detriment on multiple levels. Number one, we don't make progress that way when we dig our heels in. There's no coming together and sharing of ideas. And number two, when we lose cognitive empathy, we enhance our connection to the amygdala to lock us into short-sighted thinking and self-centered thinking. And we lose not only cognitive empathy, but another type of empathy that is, in my opinion, equally important, and that is emotional empathy. And that is the ability that we have, which can be cultivated, to experience the emotions of another person, not to try on what he or she is thinking, but to experience their emotions. I mean, we know this when you watch somebody stub their toe, we say, oh, ouch. We make the face that somebody would make if they would stub their own toe. But that's important, that we share in the pleasures and pains of other people. And that makes us more caring and compassionate individuals as we lock into the amygdala based upon all these inputs from news, from social media, et cetera. We even lose that ability. We lose the ability that we have to be compassionate beings. And that really motivated us to continue working on this book when we realized that, when you are distanced from the prefrontal cortex, a lot of things happen that aren't good. We cannot plan for the future. We cannot experience cognitive empathy, emotional empathy. We become very narcissistic, locked into the world revolving around ourselves. And right now, as you and I have this conversation, we need to function as a global community more than ever before in the history of our planet, if we are going to move ahead and move past this whole COVID thing. Because truly, when we have, and I'm hoping you'll see the segue, if we have a need to develop, let's say, herd immunity, where there's a time where everyone on the planet, or at least whatever the magic number is, 70%, has immunity, that allows us to achieve a lower than 1 R naught. The R naught has to be less than 1 to allow us then, or to allow the virus to not be able to gain foothold in enough people that it continues to propagate. That said, it's not Canada, it's not the United States, it's not North America, it's not the Americas. It is truly the globe. unless you are willing to lock down and not have interaction with anybody else, vis-a-vis New Zealand, which pulled it off because they were able to achieve an R naught less than 1. But if we're going to do this as a global community, we've all got to be in this together. And it's challenging to hear that statement, we're all in this together, when really we could be doing a lot more as a global community in the face of this challenge. And, it's basically bringing on board the prefrontal cortex to do the right thing for myself, for you, for everyone around, and even doing the right thing for our planet from even an environmental perspective.
In this next video, Dr. Sara Gottfried and I are talking about keto for women and why it is exquisitely different for us. We are talking in this next video about the testosterone advantage, cortisol, and the way that you can do keto right as a woman. Click over here and I'll see you there.
It's not a blanket statement that keto is good for everyone. I want to be sure that comes through loud and clear, because we have to personalize